interesting to hear. I understood only some of the most important words, and I can say love the end to all of you. And yes, I will now start sharing my screen. Hopefully you will see this in full screen right now. If it's not so, please let me know. Okay, so I hope I will see at least some of the faces on screen too. You of course don't have to switch on your cameras if you don't feel comfortable, but then I just feel that I'm talking to someone at least to Baiba here. The perks of being virtual. So the topic today, as you can see, is about traveling, as is also the lecture about Fanijas Bīronas travel drawings and sketches. So this is a topic that today is also problematic due to the pandemic and to other reasons. It has been very self-evident in the 21st century, but a bit different in the 18th and 19th centuries. And today I will focus on Baltic German male artists. I know that the other lectures too are focused on females who are traveling. But I'm today talking about male artists, as we didn't have that many female artists back in the day. And in the first decades of the 19th century, they traveled to Europe. And I'm going to talk about this, probably Baiba already mentioned, as also a part of their education and identity construction as well. So okay, this is switching? No? Okay, yeah. So, as you know very well, the Baltic provinces back then, Estonia, Livonia, and Curoniä, were divided as such. Now, this is not new information to you, just to give some context here and then how it think about how it was. This map is from the 1890s, but these main borders of these Baltic provinces remained unchanged in the 19th century. So we can also keep this in mind. And as you know, both in what is nowadays Latvia and Estonia, back then the Baltic Germans were those who formed this economical, cultural, and political upper class, and also were the ones who were engaged in enlightened cultural activities. And in Estonia, more self-consciously Estonian artists emerged from the 1860s onwards, beginning with Johann Köhler, who sounds very German, but he was an Estonian still. And before that, the arts were, of course, dominated by the Baltic Germans, and some of them, such as von Kügelgens, the brothers von Kügelgens, came from Germany to work in the Baltics, while others, such as Augusts Matiass Hāgens, who I'm also talking about today, were born locally, but often educated in Germany. So the artist's education back then, just to give a brief overview, was mainly through home teachers, but also in 1802, the University of Tartu was reopened again. Tartu, which is here in southern Estonia, of course, near these lakes, Võrtsjärv and Peipsi. And this was the only university in the Russian Empire that spoke German. You're probably well aware that the university was meant to be opened in Jelgava, but then it was in Tartu, and there was very historical discussion about that. But in Tartu University, also drawing school was opened. And the beginning of the 19th century saw the gradual professionalization of artists following this reopening of the university too. And drawing school was, of course, meant not only to educate artists, but also as part of general education, because drawing, there was no photography back then, and also doctors and geographers needed drawing as well. So here is an example by Karl August Senf, who was behind this opening of the drawing school in 1802. And he gave many examples, for example, these details of trees, which were intended as study materials for teaching drawing. So in my presentation, I will focus now more on these four artists. They're Augusts Matiass Hāgens, whom I mentioned, and also Gustavs Ādolfs Hipiuss, Oto Frīdrihs Ignācijs, and Augusts Georgs Vilhelms Pecolds. So I have here put the same map with their birthplaces, where were they born, just interesting to see. Hipiuss, Ignācijs, and Pecolds traveled together, and these are the dots 2, 3, and 4. They were all born in this province of Estonia, and Hipiuss and Ignācijs were very close from Hageri and Nissi, so they were attached to each other in their youth already. And Augusts Matiass Hāgens is from Viļķiems, I hope I pronounce it correctly, and this is near Valga today, from a very small district. So these protagonists here, as you can see, were about 20 years older than Fanijas Bīronas from Kurland. So they traveled a bit earlier, and all of them traveled west to enhance their education and their artistic practice. And in general, I argue that these travel materials of the Baltic German artists can be seen in the context of traveling as a means of education during this period and viewed as cultural actors in their own right. And the materials themselves provide a valuable insight in terms of what was deemed important to see, which was then also important to sketch or to copy. And the drawings and sketches later performed as agents that mediated places and people from the artist's experience to later observers and participated also in the artist's identity construction. So, but first, why traveling? And I will talk a bit about this, the cultural context of traveling back in the day. The notion of purposeful traveling, so traveling to have some purpose, to enhance your education, it was really prevalent in the Enlightenment era as an effective and gradually more accessible practice to acquire knowledge. And it was considered by some to be an even better source of information than you can get from books. So in areas where school education was limited or lacking, this traveling and personal context would have been especially important. And such was the case also in these Baltic provinces, which then belonged, as you know, to the western part of the Russian Empire. And this was an area that suffered greatly during the Great Northern War at the beginning of the 18th century. And together with this plague and famine that occurred during and after the war, these areas were pretty with a low cultural life, of course, during the lack of resources. And at the end of the 18th century, these contacts with other parts of Europe began to intensify again as cultural life became more active. And this period coincides with this pan-European surge in traveling that was even called the travel mania. Of course, this is not the travel mania in the 21st century scale, but back then is still a cultural tendency that we can follow. And traveling and travel writing was an ideal embodiment of Enlightenment ideas, because one of the main goals of the Enlightenment was to distribute knowledge and make it accessible to as wide an audience as was possible. And in the 18th century, the newspapers and traveling were seen as two main ways of obtaining knowledge. And while also conveying observations about the natural world and being both educative and entertaining, these travelogues were one of the most popular instruments of the Enlightenment. And traveling itself as a mode of education was actually widespread in European culture from earlier on, from the 16th century. If you think about the grand tours, when noblemen and craftsmen also, and artists and scholars acquired very important knowledge through traveling abroad. And this practice was also accompanied by a multitude of literary sources that together formed this ars academica, which is the art of traveling and travel writing. And academic literature contained very thorough factological data about this destination, as well as guidance on how to travel in a well-organized manner in order to gather knowledge and how to systematize that knowledge in order to then benefit this learned community. And the desire, or rather demand, for a traveler to contribute to the expansion of shared knowledge continued into 18th century as well, where enlightened society regarded this interconnected nature of knowledge and the sense of belonging to a community as something that is bound by common desires and interests. So it's also like a matter of identity. And a traveler was a person who could obtain knowledge and then become like an adult in the Enlightenment sense. If you think about Immanuel Kant's very famous phrase that you should it's difficult to say in English, but you should abandon this adolescence or become like an adult in a metaphorical sense through gaining more knowledge. And this so-called adulthood could be obtained by education, and traveling was a superb means to achieve that when offering very personal and very direct experience. So good educative travel was thought to comprise of 3 elements. So the tour should be preceded by thorough preparation first. And then when you're traveling, you should carefully keep in mind those goals that you have. And finally, you should make sure that this experience and knowledge that you acquire on the journey, that you apply it practically as well. So the many diverse influences and impulses obtained while on a tour resulted in a very intensive experience, which could also become misleading. So some people were afraid that when you come from a small village and you suddenly go to a big city like Rome in Italy, you may be misled of all these very intense emotions that you get. And in order to avoid this threat, you had to order and classify your impressions, which was the best way to achieve this was to take written notes. So this is why travel writing was almost an obligatory part of traveling. And all of this meant that this obtained knowledge should somehow be shared, something that was already happening before in the 17th century, where also accounts about traveling and this academic literature, it's from earlier times, and these were published. But by the apex of the nobleman's grand tour in Europe, and there was an abundance of published literature as reflected in these travel handbooks of the time. And for those who couldn't afford traveling themselves, these accounts of others offered the possibility to still go on a tour, but in your own living room, for example, to get this information too. So the amount of travel literature grew steadily as the numbers of travelers also grew. And on the one hand, it popularized traveling and invited others to see the distant places on their own. But on the other hand, it was producing more and more travel accounts in return. And here in this picture, you can see Goethe, a very important man back in the day in the Roman Campagna, which is one of my favorite examples of this European tendency. He's presented here by Tischbein while traveling in Italy, in the outskirts of Rome, and also together with these Roman ruins. So, means of traveling, how to travel then? Let's come to the practicalities. There were 3 main ways of movement: ships, post carriages, and on foot. So before in the medieval times, of the Hanseatic League, and the ships were very important. And also about 1800 as well, there were many accounts of artists traveling by ship. And it was not that easy as well. The ships were not intended only for travelers as they are now, of course. And when the winds were not favorable, a trip could last 2 weeks from Tallinn, Reval to northern Germany. So it was an arduous journey, however. And in the 18th century, well, the culture of travel went through several changes. It became more and more possible. Of course, it was still difficult and expensive, but it still became more and more possible to travel at all. Safety was increased and speed was increased and enhanced comfort. And these were one of the reasons why traveling became more popular and more attainable, including for the middle classes. So the artists were not usually of very noble origin. They were not that rich, but they still could travel, of course, mostly with lower means, on foot or paying a little bit for the post carriage. So this introduction of the postal system also provided a very regular and reliable and rather favorably priced option for moving between cities and villages. But on the other hand, thinkers of the late Enlightenment, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, promoted traveling on foot, that as it was very spontaneous and very firsthand, where the traveler was fully independent and could experience nature more thoroughly, more directly, and feeling its majesty and grandeur while moving. And there were even some school teachers who took classes to nature and and made some excursions in relation to this idea as well. Of course, there were no trains yet. They were coming later at the second half of the 19th century. So here is just a small illustration. I found this copy of a post carriage from the Estonian Road Museum that was made recently, in recent years, after drawings from Russia in the 1840s. And here is another example of a painting in 1838 about this Edinburgh and London Royal Mail service. So you can see an example of of course, this Russian or Baltic postal carriage is simpler. It's not that fancy, has smaller wheels. But in general, the postal system was a new invention that took off and became rather popular. This box at the my mouse. Oh, sorry. The box at the back of the carriage held post. And then there was this also a guardian guarding the post, and 2 to 4 people could sit inside. And some people, as you can see here up right, in the right-hand corner, you can move these video boxes, you can see it properly, are sitting on the roof as well. So, but traveling on foot, as I mentioned, was also sometimes even a heroic act towards obtaining knowledge. It's a common trope in Estonian cultural history as well, such as when the first Estonian-speaking poet, Kristjan Jaak Peterson, walked from Tartu to Riga in order to study at the university. And this is like a common trope, yes, in our national culture as well. And interestingly, one of the artists who I'm going to speak about too, Oto Ignatius, wrote in 1817 that he and his friends, artists, used the post carriage to get to Italy. But once they arrived, they switched to traveling by foot. So it was also possible, of course, to combine these several means. And the travel materials themselves. So the numbers and background of travelers also expanded and diversified in the Baltics at the turn of the 19th century. And there are examples of travelogues being written not only by university professors and artists, but also doctors and representatives of other professions who belong to this local, mostly German-speaking upper and middle classes. So as a side note, I would say that in this period, there is difficult to make a clear distinction between a professional artist and an intellectual with notable artistic interests. So it may be a bit blurry, this distinction, but it's maybe not that important to distinguish these two very harshly, because I'm mostly also interested about these general artistic intentions and endeavors. So like using pictures as a way to think about the world. And focusing on artists for whom it was customary to add pictorial representations of the visited sites in addition to their writing. This means of creating another layer in this knowledge, these pictorial traces. And as travel materials, I understand here these various materials, drawing, sketches on the one hand, and writing on the other, that was produced while traveling, regardless of their preliminary aims or intended outcomes. So this is an example here of Karl Grass that I remember mentioning before, and Baiba kindly mentioned that he was often thought of as a Latvian artist, so to say, and yes, well, of course, back in the day, the national borders were not that. It's as you could see, the Baltic provinces were arranged differently. So Karl Grass was one of the first of artists from the Baltic provinces to go westwards. So here an example from him as well, and one could typically distinguish 4 types of travel materials developed by the Baltic German artists at the beginning of the 19th century. Firstly, there were diaries that were kept while traveling, such as the journal of Augusts Matiass Hāgens that you can see here on the left. Diaries were rather personal and rather direct, seemingly mediating what the artist had in mind and underlining what kind of impressions were most important to them. For instance, Hāgens' diary is a rather funny thing to read because it also exemplifies his somewhat grumpy and adventurous character. And it's also rather emotional, which is something that could be influenced by the fact that he met his future wife while he was traveling in Passau on the way to Switzerland. And this diary was not published in the 19th century, but this is now translated into Estonian and published anew in the 21st century already. And secondly, there were travel materials that some could even be described as studies that were intentionally created for publishing, which were often by literati from various backgrounds. Most were probably notes taken at the trip itself that were later rewritten and edited into a coherent text and then published. A good example of this are the writings of Karl Morgenstern, who, as a university professor who was very prominent in several fields, worked very diligently for the better education of others. And he was also the editor of Dörptische Beiträge für Freunde der Philosophie, Literatur und Kunst. Here is Baltische Monatsschrift, another journal. And he also published contributions from other travelers. And his plans to publish his own travel writings were so ambitious that he only managed to publish one 900-page book about Italy that you can see here on the right. But he intended to make 3 of such books, but these separate volumes about France, Switzerland, and Germany were planned but remained unfinished. So this is like secondly an example of this educated person writing about his travels. And thirdly, there were accounts written by artists such as Oto Ignatius that were created intentionally for publishing as well, and I will mention this further later. And fourthly, there could be a compilation of different travel materials with a view to publishing it later, where here the author of the compilation might not be the traveler himself, but someone else. For example, this is now August Petzold's son, Leopold Petzold, who compiled materials from the diaries and the notes of his father and his father's friends, Hipiuss and Ignatius. And this compilation was published in 1889 till 1890 in journal Baltische Monatsschrift, you can see here on the left. And this was published about 70 years later than after the tour had taken place. But however, Leopold Petzold stated very clearly that it was the traveler's original intention to publish it. So he now carried it out. So let's come to these 3 friends that he writes about. Here you can see a portrait of Oto Frīdrihs Ignācijs on the left, Augusts Georgs Vilhelms Pecolds in the middle, and Gustavs Ādolfs Hipiuss on the right, from their traveling years in the 1810s. And Karl Philipp IV was one of their friends who tragically died at a young age. He was drowned, and but before he managed to draw these 3 friends I am now talking about. So these are 3 artists. Petzold, Hipiuss, and Ignatius had their so-called Wanderjahre in Europe from about 1815 until 1821. And they spent their years studying in Berlin and in Vienna before they extensively toured Italy. Along the way, they drafted pictures of landscapes and historic monuments, as well as portraits, as you can see here, and recorded city life. For example, Hipiuss Hipiuss here, drew portraits of Ludwig van Beethoven and Bertolt Thorvaldsen and Friedrich Overbeck, who were all famous artists in Europe. And they had a very avid interest in classical European art history, and they wrote very vivid accounts of the monuments they saw in Italy. And the joint travel of these 3 friends offers an interesting example here, showing artistic cooperation and highlighting various stages of how they mediated information. The traveling artists were definitely influenced by their background. They grew up in an environment where music and art were encouraged. Ignatius and Hipiuss, who were from Nissi and Hagari, these nearby Estonian places that you saw before, they were first educated in this parsonage of Hagari, where their tutors were the musician Johann August Hagen, who is probably not related to Augusts Matiass Hāgens, who I mentioned, and also artist Karl Sigismund Walter, who was rather prolific in Estonia back then. Both of them were invited to, both of these teachers were invited from Germany to Hagari by the playwright, diplomat, and theater activist August von Kotzebue, also very important in Estonian cultural history. He originated from Weimar originally, but spent a large part of his life working in the Baltic province of Estonia. And Kotzebue himself had also visited Italy in 1804 and until 1805, And he's writing of his travels. What was called Erinnerungen von einer Reise aus Livland nach Rom und Neapel was published in Berlin in 1805. And this was one of the first of its kind to be written by an intellectual who was active in the Baltics. And although Kotzebue's text was rather ironical and even critical towards the monuments of Italy, mostly because of how they were seen with such unending amazement. And although it was published in Berlin, it is probable that Hipiuss and Ignatius were at least knew about this, at least were familiar with this, if not even influenced by it later. And the education of these young artists continued in academies of art in St. Petersburg and Berlin and Vienna, where the study system was rather conservative, at least as they mention it, that it was. And it relied on copying old masters and antique sculptures. And from early on, the students here looked forward to self-organized excursions that allowed them to see the world on their own and to sketch freely. And ultimately, they decided to leave the academies. So their studies there were left, I think we might say, unfinished. But however, they decided they would learn more when traveling. And the rest of their Wanderjahre was mostly spent in Italy and visiting galleries and churches and forming contacts with the German community in Rome and also the so-called Nazarene artists. So Otto Ignatius here, this is now his friend's Hipiuss painting, portrait of this painter Otto Ignatius, and it was made in 1852, I think. I can't see the date now. Yeah, 52. And I've added this exclamation mark here because, as you can see from his life years. Okay, I'm sorry, you can't see it right now. But he died in 1824 at a very young age. So it is a posthumous portrait by his friend, like a memory portrait, probably after some drawings. Okay, but Hipiuss, Ignatius here, when he wrote about his travels, he leaves no room for doubts as to whether it would be beneficial to visit Italy or not. And he suggested that the joy of seeing everything with your own eyes is incomparable to reproduction. He writes that even though he knew these places by Canaletto's works, but still this impression of everything was so powerful and so new that he felt almost to be in a very, very new place, as by magic. So he was very emotional about seeing it on his own as well. And Ignatius was also certain that these impressions will have an influence upon his later creation. And he wrote in German, of course, that he was a child of luck, and God has given him the eyes to see everything and these feelings to take everything, these impressions in, and he was very sure about that it will bear fruit in his art as well. Well, now the three friends here, while traveling, they met other artists as well, of course, and formed a friendship with Julius Schnorr von Karolsfeld, who was a member of the Nazarene movement. They met him already in Vienna, and they spent some memorable moments together, were eating and drinking and discussing about the history of art. And Hipiuss here arrived in Rome in early 1817 and also visited Casa Bartoldi, where he saw the frescoes of the Nazarene painters. And Hipiuss had some doubts about the Nazarenes maybe before, but then these frescoes had a good influence upon him, and he formed a closer relationship with Friedrich Overbeck as well. He very much admired his work, and they formed a close friendship. And while in Berlin, Ignatius and Petzold stayed at the home of Gottfried Schadow, also an important Nazarene artist, and his son, Friedrich Wilhelm Schadow, was a well-known painter as well, and Ignatius later married Gottfried Schadow's daughter, Adelheid, and became close friends with her brother. So they formed very close family ties during these travels as well, which is, of course, very human and understandable when you're staying for a long time in a foreign place. So this kind of extensive traveling has generally been shown to be a decisive factor in the education and development of the young artists. And it is very probable that it added much to the sparkling but short career of Otto Ignatius, who became an imperial court artist in St. Petersburg at a very young age, and soon after he returned from Italy. Here you can see Otto Ignatius' sketch for a religious scene that is held in the Estonian Museum of Art, which is oil on canvas, a work that I have written a bit more about in my other article considering religious art in Estonia in that period. And this is now a sketch, but it was intended for the Royal Chapel of Tsarskoye Selo, a ceiling painting. And it was he started this, but his friend Hipiuss had to finish this because Otto Ignatius, unfortunately, has died when he was 30 years old, probably from tuberculosis, I think. And so, yes, his life was rather short, but you can see an impression of Hipiuss, of him as a very young and sensitive man, definitely. So his friend Hipiuss became an important artistic figure in Tallinn in the middle of the 19th century, and Hipiuss was also an active art teacher and author of several books in the same field. And it has been estimated that Hipiuss' actions led to a more organized and professional cultural life in Tallinn, and his contacts and early influences probably had a very big impact on his endeavors and shaped his later life as well. So in addition to these direct relationships with other noteworthy artists, the three friends produced travel materials, of course, as was customary, and the details of their travels are now have reached us thanks largely to Leopold Petzolds' compilation that I mentioned earlier. But Leopold Petzold was not the first to publish information about them and about their travels, because when arriving to Italy, Otto Ignatius started writing rather thorough accounts of the artistic monuments he saw. And he wrote in his diary that he wrote to his family as well, that in addition to letters, he would write a very important diary where he attaches drawings. And the thought that this diary would one day reach the loved ones back in home makes this, so to say, trouble very sweet to him. It's a very emotional way of saying back then. And his thoughts and impressions were only published in excerpts, first in St. Peterburgische Zeitschrift in 1823, and then already posthumously in a weekly journal Estona in 1829, 1830. And he sent his materials to this St. Petersburg journal magazine Zeitschrift himself. And he accompanied notes that I find very, very interesting, where he describes his work and explains why an artist should still publish his travel notes from Italy while there are already so many. On the contrary, his goal is to offer his views on art, not just travel notes. And he writes that, yes, his intention is to think on a broader scale and not just write about what he saw, but also think about this and offer thoughts of an artist while thinking about art in general. So his intention to publish his notes is rather convincing, since he claims that he already had some agreements with publishers in Germany, but then he received a better offer from Russia and intended to publish it in Russia. And his ambitious plans, the plans were really ambitious. Pre-orders were accepted in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Warsaw, Riga, Tallinn, Tartu, Turku, and Jelgava. And but the plans were unfortunately never realized because, yes, he died very soon. And in general, when we think about the role of pictures or the genres that we can speak about, it's interesting to see that why were these travel accounts also very popular was the fact that novels, large novels, were generally not the most favored literary genre in the Baltic region, because the audience preferred rather practical texts that were either educative or informative or had at least some connection to real life and were not just about fictional characters. And these expectations were rather well accommodated by travel writing. And these publications were mostly, yes, intended for the German-speaking reader, most of whom were such as state officials or professors or pastors and writers too. And here, before coming to the role of pictures in that sense, I would also mention, of course, Augusts Matiass Hāgens, who traveled mostly to Germany and to Switzerland. So this is another example of an artist traveling, because his intentions, his destinations were a bit different. But I think that these three friends on the one hand and Hāgens on the other hand exemplify rather well the general tendencies from two sides. So in 1820 until 1824, Hāgens traveled to Germany and Switzerland, and his sketches and diaries exemplify that he had a most interest in landscapes, that he sketched very enthusiastically, and his travel destinations confirm that, because who wanted to see nature tended to go to Switzerland rather. And but still he saw cultural sites and had some experience with the local art life, and these accounts in his diaries are very interwoven with his personal encounters and his relationships also with the local people, given that his primary goal was to see the Alps, as we can see in this drawing as well. The weather and nature were also very dominant themes in his work. And he writes about those topics as well, and also about funny things about having a dog and accompanying it with his routes. So here are some examples of his work that are rather exemplary of this period, and we can see a lot of these. So I mentioned before that the novels were and other high genres were not that popular back then, because people preferred mostly like practical writing. And it's also, we can see this kind of tendency in pictures as well, because in the Baltic Enlightenment, these high genres and mediums such as oil paintings and historical topics were rather scarce. There is not so many of those, but drawings and sketches and graphic sheets can be found in abundance. And a large portion of this visual culture also had a very practical and educative character, a didactic nature that considered the promotion of society to be more important than aesthetic values. Well, we can debate this, but in general, yes, this very practical sense was kept in mind. And cases where artists embarked on a journey to sketch people and landscapes were intentional efforts to offer a structured pictorial representation of the world that's otherwise chaotic. So it's like a way to think as well. And the fact that objects such as artworks could have an important role in the network of knowledge was felt at the beginning of the 19th century in Europe in general rather strongly. We can talk about, so to say, restructuring of knowledge back then, where new institutions such as universities and museums and libraries emerged. And however, this new regime of knowledge was not only institutional, as a cultural historian Peter Berg has shown. I quote, the point to emphasize is that art was coming to be regarded as a form of knowledge and part of the new regime, and the Bildende Künste were viewed as a means to Bildung. So it shows clearly that how this pictorial and art was definitely a part of education. As the travelers in this instance were practicing artists, the travel materials were two-tiered. The written accounts were accompanied by drawings and vice versa, which would at once raise questions about the relationship, about the image to the text. But it's a bit difficult to answer these questions. I mean, how did the artists intend to accompany these drawings, these writings with the drawings, and vice versa, because the materials have been dispersed and scattered in the 2 centuries that have since gone by. But for example, Leopold Petzold offers an interesting description of the different practices of the artists he writes about. For example, he says that Otto Ignatius spent the most time detailing his accounts of the historical artworks he saw in Italy, which he intended to accompany with drawings of those for publication. But the drawings were unfortunately lost already to Leopold Petzold in the end of the 19th century. And Hipiuss also included information of the history of art that he encountered in his notes from the same period, while Petzold confined himself to drawing and only sometimes wrote diary-like notes on the back of his sketches, so the practice was quite different. And Leopold Petzold remarks that diary entries become less frequent than when the artist produced more sketches and vice versa. So it is likely that these texts and sketches were not always connected when they were made. But Augusts Matiass Hāgens also describes his working methods in his diaries. On 13th October 1820, he copied a landscape from another artist from memory, changing some details only, which is interesting. And he mentions that on 2nd June 1821, the weather acted upon him. It was rainy and cloudy, and it didn't allow him to sketch a complete landscape. And consequently, he started to combine several elements. And 2 days later, he offers a description that is, where is it now? Yep, here. An interesting description that seems quite typical of his work. He had sketched the outline of the ruins in Wolkenstein. I'm not sure that this is the same picture, but it's a similar one, so we can still see this. The day before, and worked with the lighting on the next day. And on the following day, he had intended to color some contours with Indian ink. As you can see here, is also used Indian ink and paper. And as it was a personal diary, he also mentions digestive problems and his dog in the same paragraph. So it's a rather mixed, but he still writes about how he was drawing and what did he do on which days. And so it's interesting to think about that. And the traveling artists were definitely also affected by the tours later in their life, while Hagen's sketches were mostly executed in situ on the place. His way of perceiving landscape was also later evident when making Veduta in Livonia. And as the most renowned landscape artist of the period, his works also had an impact on others and probably influenced his daughter, Julia Wilhelmina Hagenschwarz, who was a well-known artist in her own right, the first female artist I will mention today, and one of the first and most important female artists in the 19th century that's of whom Estonian art history writes about. So it was the daughter of Augusts Matiass Hāgens. And Gustav Ádolfs Hipiuss returned to his home in Hagari on 9th November 1819, so a bit over 200 years ago. And in 1821, exactly 200 years ago, as you can see here, he created a copper engraving which depicted pilgrims who probably were also art pilgrims who are here greeting the city of Rome. And this is a group of people. Some are here kneeling in the background. Some are waving to the city with overflowing joy. And they have gathered on a hilltop where they probably see Rome in the distance for the first time. And they are shown traveling on foot here, as was common for pilgrims and for young artists alike. But it was also, yes, a favorable method to experience nature back then. And Hipiuss' work, as it is created later when they came back already, it probably shows a deeply felt nostalgia for the tour in Italy. And visiting Rome was definitely an important event to be remembered and depicted. And in this work by Hipiuss, this scene was inspired by personal experience, but later abstracted as a general sign of the importance of visiting Rome. And an exemplary depiction of a very self-conscious artist here, relating himself to classical heritage, is given by Hipiuss' friend August Petzold, who painted a self-portrait, as you can see here, with the Colosseum in the background. So it was painted in 1818, so as stated, and we can say the portrait was created while he was in Rome. And Petzold shows himself standing here 3/4 in front of his easel. His palette is on the right and hanging, and the window or a painting showing the Colosseum is in evening light on the left. And Petzold has here set himself in a very honorable tradition of painting a self-portrait with classical ruins. just as we saw before, of Tischbein's portrait of Goethe. And one of my other favorite examples of all times, Martin van Heemskerk, already from 1553, also a self-portrait with the Colosseum. And here it's also just an interesting example that van Heemskerk is known to have visited Rome 16 years before 1553. So this painting is created also a lot later, almost 2 decades later after visiting. And he also shows most probably himself here in the picture, up here, sitting in the lower right corner and drawing these ruins, as it was like very, very, very important to him. And so these were more just some of the Baltic German artists who were traveling in Europe at the time. And the numbers were growing as the exchange of ideas and knowledge via traveling became a very widespread practice. And in this context of knowledge valuing enlightenment, I argue that the artists were very conscious participants in this heritage production, and they were intentionally mediating and creating new knowledge for the contemporaries and for following generations. And this is, yes, exemplified by the fact that they returned from their travels with drawings and notes and prints by other artists. And many of these were not intended solely for the artist's own use, but to be seen and read by others as well. And both the tone of the writings and the later works, such as here, suggest that, and here that was created later, suggest that being a part of the European culture and artistic heritage formed a very important part of their identities, and here traveling is part of identity construction as well. And the choice of their travel destinations is hardly surprising, as it is in very tight accordance with the custom of educational traveling in Enlightenment era Europe, where there were 2 main destinations, both of which had their own allure. Italian cities, of course, attracted artists with a rich art history, and for centuries, a nobleman's grand tour was unthinkable without visiting Italy. And in the first half of the 19th century, awareness of aesthetics and the history of art also grew in the Baltic provinces, and it gradually became the norm that artists should have some knowledge in these areas as well. Otherwise, it would be, you couldn't be a very serious artist. From the second half of the 18th century onwards, Switzerland and the Alps also became a rather important travel destination, as the growth of the Romantic movement led to a desire to experience nature in all its majesty, as seen in Hagen's landscape sketch with mountains and romantic ruins in the center of the show. And as the travels of Baltic German artists in general show, both Italy and Switzerland were popular travel destinations. And at last, it seems that they always traveled through Germany, probably for geographical reasons and because the cultural connections that the artists had with the region as Baltic Germans, they felt tightly connected to Germany. The ports of Tallinn, or Reval back then, and Riga had been well connected to North German harbors for centuries, of course. So to sum it up, I would say that traveling has been very helpful in creating and establishing such communicative networks and in obtaining and mediating knowledge through many centuries. And it could be argued that a sense of a common Europe was felt in the 18th century, which was largely established in iconography that relied upon classical antiquity. And in the Enlightenment period, art fulfilled, amongst other things, a role as a mediator of knowledge, and as such definitely played a part in educational practices, as did traveling. And traveling as a very educative method gradually became more and more approachable from this point onwards. And these travel and art as mediators of knowledge went hand in hand when it came to traveling artists, where the places they experienced were later reproduced both in text and in visuals, as we can see in their works. And in general, their destinations were in line with the most popular of the time. And we can say that their impressions were rather positive or even very positive and emotional. and they valued the power of witnessing these landscapes and these monuments firsthand very, very strongly, and advised it to others as well. And in many cases, we can see that the artist's materials were explicitly intended for publishing, either as a separate volume or in a journal that circulated, for example, among professors or other artists or pastors and teachers or officials who all belonged to this German-speaking community. And some of the information was, of course, shared in personal materials that were either meant as such an aide-memoire for the artists themselves, or to be sent to their families, which is very grateful thing to do, because some of the letters have preserved. And in some cases, this material was later published, probably because the next generations regarded it as worth sharing. Some of the times artists wanted to publish it themselves, and sometimes they didn't manage to do it. And in the case of Otto Ignācijs, the artist here himself worked diligently in order to publish his writings and drawings, in order to engage not only with the travel genre, but to offer something in the wider theoretical discussion of art that was definitely ignited by his experience in Italy. And his companions, Hipiuss and Pecolds, were also influenced by the years of traveling that drew them together with the Nazarene movement, amongst others. And as the artist's contacts show, this communication and exchange was rather intense, considering, of course, the physical limitations of the travel. And here, to sum it up, it's an undated view, unfortunately undated, but by Augusts Pecolds, a view of Tallinn from the sea. So thank you very much. I think for now, it's all from me. So if you have some questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. We had experience to see some examples, and if I will, yeah. If you others have questions, please write in chat and I will give them, or if you want to speak and your own to ask the question, but I will probably start. And if I understood right, then you research mostly those are letters and the memoirs and such kind of materials. Do you have found materials also about other traveling artists from the Baltics from that period, maybe some female artists or?
Well, I must also say that this is definitely a work in progress. And this question of traveling is, yes, has been like one of my interests, but it's only one aspect of my work in general. So I must say that right now, I don't have any very good examples that come into my mind. I should look at this question of female artists maybe more thoroughly, but we have materials from a bit later period. For example, I mentioned Julia Hagenschwarz, who you definitely know, and about her we have information, and she is regarded as one of the first female artists here. But there are accounts of female travelers, of course, from this period and from earlier on as well. But it's also sometimes difficult to say who was an artist and who was not. And I think yes, I can't. I think I don't have any very interesting examples to give here in addition. But of course, male artists and male writers were definitely traveling. I mentioned Kotzebue, Morgenstern, Stackelberg, Grass, Krause. Yes, there's an abundance of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then you had quotes from the letters and others. So that means you have read the material. How it is when we are looking at and thinking about the travelers who are not artists, they sometimes also describe the artists' workshops or studios which they visited, and also we have here in Baltics examples from that late 18th, early 19th century where those local Baltic travelers have collected albums of drawings from others. Do we have some kind of signs that those artists who traveled also collected something, or visited other studios and described?
Yes, they mentioned it. They mention it pretty much, but unfortunately, we don't have always this material substance to be as an evidence. For example, this my three friends here, they mention it as well, and they were definitely in close contact with the artists, and then they I think also visited their studios, and there are mentions of how they gathered works by their new friends, other artists as well, and some graphic reproductions too. And but yes, mostly it's hard to say what is it exactly. I mean, if somebody would research it very, very thoroughly, maybe we could find something. But at the moment, I cannot say of anything certain that we would have from that. But they mention it in their text. Yes.
Thank you. I say that we do not have questions in
I see there are something has been
said. There is several thanks
thank you very much
for lecture. Thanks for this interesting lecture, and the Vita, right, this is a very interesting focus and view of your study. Thank you so much for this lecture.
Oh, thank you.
There are thank yous.
Thank you so much. It's nice to hear that, because when you're here on your own, especially in the pandemic, it's so you won't get any feedback that much.
Is it possible to ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Is it possible to get these books about traveling in German for reading? For example, Karl Morgenstern's Reise in Italian, and the diaries of Augusts Matiass Hāgens, and if it is possible, where?
Yes, a very good question. Of course, I think one thing that we should do, also that I should do, is take more into account these archives and resources that you have in Latvia. And then also we have a very good resource in Tartu University Library. I can, wait, let me see the chat. And this is like, I hope I wrote to chat this address. I hope you can find this. This is the internet resources or depository of Tartu University, and I have found very many materials that are digitized from there. And of course, you can see them in person, in live, in a physical form as well in this. Also in Tartu University Library mostly. And in Estonian libraries, when we have these halls of this, the Baltica and these old books, but a lot of these are actually scanned, digitized, and you can see them in search in this dspace.ut.ee. So I hope it will be helpful. And if you would like to know anything more, if I can help, you can write to me, and maybe I should give my email address here in the chat. If anybody is interested.
You can.
Yeah. Okay. I think I put stop share right now, so I can. So I can see the chat better. And write my email. This is the. Better sides of having a digital communication. Okay, yeah. So this is my email address. So you can write in. Unfortunately, I don't understand Latvian, but you can write in English and ask your questions too, if I know, if I can.
So, do we have another questions or comments from others? I don't see that some others would ask something. Then I probably will say thank you, Līsa, and thank for this interesting talk. And yes, I didn't ask how far you are with your paper. Maybe we can read it already after some time.
Oh yes, if you mean the paper, then yes, this is already published. So as I forgot to mention that the talk that I gave today is also the same material, the same focus is published in a paper it had a little bit different title. I can say right now it's I should check this. Where was it?
When we are Googling your name, actually, we can find this paper.
Yes.
My question was mostly about your PhD.
Your PhD, of course. I thought that it might be so. It takes a couple of years more.
Okay.
Yes. So this far I have published a paper regarding the topic that I talked about today. And also about religious art in the Baltic provinces, mostly in Estonia. Also in terms with this context with the Nazarene artists, I have also been interested in this, and so these papers are published. But in general, yes, my dissertation will probably be a monograph, not a dissertation of articles, so it would take a bit more time to come into defense. I hope in 2 years I should make this.
Yeah, we are hoping to read it probably, because that's so. I would from my side, from museum's side, yeah, you have the already in chat somebody wrote good luck. So that's and of course that's what we are hoping, that it's coming soon, and you will be it will be the book, a good and interesting book which we can also read. It will be Estonian or English, or you don't know.
I have planned to make it in Estonian. It's a bit of like a mission to enhance Estonian language, scientific academic literature as well. But it would definitely, I think I will publish some more articles maybe in English, and it would, of course, it would have a thorough summary. So yeah, but I think I wouldn't skip the plan to write it in Estonia.
Yeah, because I'm just saying, because that's actually the period of these Baltic provinces, which is also very interesting for other colleagues who are working in Latvia with this period and see. And you can also, so that's we have common history, common art history, which is very nice to share. So. Yes.
Definitely, I agree, and I think it has been a problem that we have this border near Valka, and we have different languages, which is of course good in terms of diversity and in world culture, but it also creates this separation that actually, especially in this period, would be better to make more co-work.
Okay, so. Thank you very much for your lecture, and we need to thank also our Cultural Capital Foundation, which supports us for making this lecture course, and hope you see to read your papers and to see you, in presence in some other places. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming, attending, listening, and thank you for inviting. It has been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.